Good evening, I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. After 28 years in the skies, I thought I'd seen every kind of passenger. I was wrong. Tonight, let me tell you what happened on Flight 2249. Gate C-14 at Newark was crowded that evening. Rain hammered the windows. Among the tired travelers stood a woman in wrinkled blue scrubs, an ID badge still clipped to her chest. Elena Ruiz, RN. She'd worked a 31-hour shift at a VA hospital in New Jersey. 3 of those hours spent trying to save a young veteran who didn't make it. She hadn't slept. She hadn't changed. She just wanted to get home to Ohio. At the counter, a gate agent apologized. "Ms. Ruiz, we've upgraded you to first class, seat 2A. Compensation for the delay." Elena blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected kindness after a day like this. She thanked the agent quietly and walked toward the jet bridge, her sneakers squeaking on tile, her eyes red from exhaustion. She scrolled through her phone as she waited to board, staring at a photo she'd taken that morning. A young soldier's boots, still laced, sitting beside a hospital bed that was now empty. She hadn't been able to bring herself to delete it. Somewhere in Kentucky, a mother was planning a funeral she never thought she'd have to plan this soon. Elena had called her personally, sat on the phone for 20 minutes so the woman wouldn't have to hear the news from a stranger's voice on a hospital switchboard. Boarding began. Elena moved slowly, her body aching in the particular way that comes from standing on hospital tile for over a day straight. She barely registered the businessmen in tailored suits breezing past her toward the first-class cabin, laptop bags slung over their shoulders, already on calls about quarterly earnings and closing dates. Different world, she thought, different kind of tired. Seated in 2B was Richard Colton, a wealthy real estate developer who traveled first class every week and treated it like his personal office. He had a habit of talking loudly on his phone until the very last second before the doors closed, as if the rules of the cabin didn't quite apply to him. Next to him, seat 2C, sat his associate, a younger man named Tyler who laughed too easily at Richard's jokes and nodded along to keep his job comfortable. Richard had built his fortune flipping commercial properties across 3 states, and somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that the price of a ticket bought more than a seat, it bought a certain kind of company. He glanced up from his laptop as new passengers filed past, sizing each one up out of habit, the way some people check the exits in a room. When Elena sat down in 2A, Richard's eyes moved over her scrubs, her scuffed shoes, the faint smell of hospital antiseptic still clinging to her clothes. He exchanged a look with Tyler, the kind of look that needed no words to communicate its judgment. "Excuse me," Richard said to the flight attendant, "is this seat correct? I don't think this is right." The flight attendant, a young man named Diego, checked his tablet. "Yes, sir, seat 2A is confirmed." "She's in scrubs," Richard said, lowering his voice but not enough. "This is first class. We paid for this." Elena said nothing. She'd heard worse from grieving families. She simply buckled her seatbelt and closed her eyes. But Richard wasn't finished. "No offense," he said, turning to her directly, "but shouldn't hospital staff clean up before flying with paying customers?" A few passengers nearby went quiet. An older woman in 3A lowered her magazine just enough to watch. A mother across the aisle pulled her son a little closer, the way people do when they sense conflict brewing but don't want to be pulled into it. Elena kept her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap. She'd learned, over years of dealing with frightened families and impatient doctors, that silence sometimes did more work than words. But her jaw tightened, just slightly, betraying the exhaustion she was fighting to hold beneath the surface. Diego opened his mouth to intervene, but before he could speak, a deep, calm voice came from seat 2D across the aisle. "Is there a problem here?" The voice belonged to a broad-shouldered man in his 60s, silver hair cut close, sitting with perfect posture. He wore a plain gray jacket, no rank visible, no uniform, just an ordinary traveler, or so it seemed. His hands were folded on the tray table in front of him, calm and still, but there was something in the way he held his shoulders, a stillness that came from decades of discipline, not comfort. He had boarded early, said little, and spent most of the pre-flight routine watching the cabin the way a man watches a room out of long habit, cataloging details without meaning to. He'd clocked Richard's tone the moment the man opened his mouth, and something about the exchange had pulled at an old, familiar irritation. "No problem," Richard said quickly, waving a hand. "Just clarifying seating." The man's eyes moved to Elena. Something in his expression shifted, recognition, though Elena didn't notice yet. She was too tired, too focused on breathing evenly, on not crying in front of strangers. The flight pushed back. Wheels lifted off the runway into the storm. Diego made his rounds with water and blankets, and as he passed Elena, he offered a small nod, an unspoken apology for what she'd endured before takeoff. 20 minutes into the flight, Richard leaned toward Tyler and muttered something about standards slipping in this industry. Elena's jaw tightened, but she stayed silent. She had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth the energy, especially not after a day where she'd already lost one. She stared out the window at the clouds, lit orange by the setting sun, replaying the last hour of her shift in her mind. The monitor's flat tone, the way the young soldier's mother had sobbed over the phone, thanking Elena for staying, even though there was nothing left to do but stay. She wondered, not for the first time, whether the exhaustion was worth it, whether any of it mattered to people who would never understand what the job cost. Then the man in 2D spoke again, this time directly to her. "Rough shift?" Elena turned, surprised anyone had asked. 31 hours, she said. "Lost a patient tonight, a young vet, 24 years old." The man's jaw tensed. "What unit?" "3rd Battalion. Came home 8 months ago. Complications from an old injury." Her voice cracked slightly. "I held his hand until the end because his family couldn't get there in time." The man in 2D was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant, as if the mention of a young soldier dying at 24 had opened a door he kept carefully shut most days. Elena noticed the shift but said nothing, assuming it was simply the natural discomfort people felt around death. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather wallet, flipping it open just enough for Elena to see, a military identification card. Lieutenant General Harold Reyes, United States Marine Corps, retired. Elena's breath caught. "General, at ease," he said gently, the corner of his mouth lifting. "You held that soldier's hand so his family didn't have to imagine him alone. That's not just a job, ma'am. That's a calling." Richard, overhearing, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly very interested in his phone. But the story was only beginning. Turbulence rattled the cabin as the plane pushed through the storm front. The seatbelt sign chimed on, and Diego moved quickly down the aisle, securing loose cups and trays. Elena gripped her armrest, her sleeve pulling back slightly to reveal a jagged scar running from her wrist to her forearm, old, faded, clearly years healed, but deep, the kind of scar that told a story without needing words. Richard, still nursing his wounded pride from the earlier exchange, glanced over out of idle curiosity. Even Tyler noticed it, his eyebrows lifting slightly before he looked away, unsure what he'd just seen. General Reyes's eyes locked onto it, his posture straightened. "Where did you get that scar?" he asked, voice suddenly sharper. Elena pulled her sleeve down instinctively, an old habit. "Kandahar, 2011. I was an Army combat medic before I became a civilian nurse." The cabin lights flickered with a burst of turbulence. Richard grabbed his armrest, momentarily forgetting his complaints. General Reyes leaned forward, his composure cracking for the first time since he'd boarded. "Combat medic, Kandahar, 2011. Forward Operating Base Wilson?" Elena's eyes widened. "How do you know that?" "Because there was a young Marine sergeant pulled out of a burning vehicle that year." His voice grew quieter, heavier, like a man carrying a weight he rarely set down in front of strangers. "An IED hit the convoy. 2 men didn't make it out. The 3rd was burned, bleeding, barely conscious. Everyone said the medic who worked on him didn't stop for 6 hours straight, even after her own arm was torn open by shrapnel from a secondary blast. She kept pressure on his wounds with one hand and stitched her own arm one-handed between checking his pulse. Command wrote her up for a commendation, but she'd already been discharged and vanished into civilian life before anyone could present it. I read that report more times than I can count. I always wondered what happened to her." Elena's hands began to tremble. That was me. That Marine," General Reyes said quietly, "was my son." The cabin went silent, except for the hum of engines and the soft patter of rain against the fuselage. Tyler had stopped scrolling his phone. Even Richard turned to look, his earlier arrogance draining from his face. "Your son," Elena whispered. "Is he alive?" General Reyes said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because a 23-year-old medic refused to give up on him, even while bleeding herself. I've spent 13 years trying to find her to say thank you. The Army lost her paperwork in a transfer. I hired people to search. I never imagined I'd find her in seat 2A on a rainy Tuesday night." Diego, standing in the aisle with a coffee pot in hand, had frozen mid-pour, eyes glistening. Even the older woman in 3A had lowered her magazine entirely, watching the scene unfold with her hand pressed to her chest. Elena covered her mouth, tears finally breaking through the exhaustion she'd been holding back all day. 13 years of not knowing rushed to the surface all at once. Every quiet night she'd wondered if the young sergeant had survived the flight to Landstuhl, if he'd made it home, if the 6 hours she'd spent kneeling in dust and blood had meant anything in the end. "I think about that day every year," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never knew if he made it home. I never got an answer. You spend your whole career giving everything you have to strangers, and most of the time, you never find out if it was enough." "He's a father now," General Reyes said. 2 daughters. He coaches Little League on weekends. He's alive because of you." The cabin, moments ago charged with tension over a seating complaint, now sat in a different kind of silence, the kind that comes when people realize how small their earlier concerns actually were. Somewhere behind them, a child asked her mother why the man in first class was crying, and the mother simply said, "Sometimes grown-ups cry because they're grateful, sweetheart," and left it at that. Richard sat frozen for a long moment, his laptop forgotten, his earlier confidence gone entirely. He thought about the meeting he'd been so eager to prepare for, the complaint he'd made about legroom just an hour earlier, and felt something close to shame settle over him. He cleared his throat, his voice noticeably smaller than before. "I didn't realize. I'm sorry. I spoke out of line earlier." Elena, still wiping tears, looked at him without anger. "It's all right. People judge what they see. You didn't know what the scrubs meant." But General Reyes wasn't ready to let it go so easily. He turned to Richard with the calm authority of a man who had commanded thousands. "Mr. Colton, is it? You do quite a bit of business travel, I understand." Richard nodded cautiously. "Then you understand reputations," Reyes continued. "In the military, we learn early that the person carrying the least visible rank is often carrying the most weight. The soldier without insignia, the medic without medals, the nurse in wrinkled scrubs who just spent 31 hours holding a dying man's hand so his mother wouldn't have to hear he died alone." Richard's throat tightened. He glanced at Elena, then back at his own hands, turning them over as though seeing them for the first time in years. "I travel this route for work," Richard admitted quietly. "Every week, sometimes twice. My father built this company from nothing, and I've spent 15 years trying to prove I deserve to run it. Somewhere along the way, I started measuring my worth by seat numbers and upgrade emails. I complain about legroom and seat assignments because it's the only thing I feel like I can control some days. That's not an excuse. It's just true." He looked up at Elena. "You spent 6 hours saving a man's life while bleeding yourself, and I spent the last hour complaining about where you were sitting. I don't know how to sit with that comfortably, but I don't think I'm supposed to." Tyler, sitting beside him, looked at his boss with something like surprise. He'd never heard Richard admit weakness before. Elena softened. "Everyone's carrying something," she said. "I've learned that in the ER more than anywhere else. The man who screams at the front desk is usually scared, not cruel. Doesn't make it right, but it makes it human." Richard nodded slowly, something shifting behind his eyes. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. "Ma'am," he said, using the word for the first time that night, "would you let me buy you dinner when we land? Not as an apology exactly, more like a chance to actually meet you instead of judging you." Elena considered it, then gave a small, tired smile. "Buy the flight crew dinner instead. They're the ones who deal with people like you and me every single day." Diego, still holding the coffee pot, laughed despite himself, breaking the emotional weight of the cabin just slightly. "I mean it," Richard added, and for the first time all evening, he sounded like he meant something completely. "Whatever you need on this flight, meal, blanket, silence, it's yours. And when we land, if you'll let me, I'd like to make a donation to that VA hospital in your name. Not for show, because it's the least I can do." Elena studied him for a moment, weighing the offer, deciding whether it was performance or something real. She decided it didn't matter which. The hospital needed the help either way. "They could use a new ultrasound machine in the ER," she said simply. "Ask for Dr. Whitfield. Tell her Elena sent you." Richard nodded, already pulling out his phone to make a note, something in his posture straighter and more purposeful than it had been all flight. 20 minutes before landing, General Reyes had grown quiet, staring out the window at the scattered lights below, his fingers tapping absently against his knee. He seemed to be working something out in his mind, weighing whether to ask a question that had clearly been building since the moment Elena told him where the scar came from. Finally, he turned to her. "Would you want to speak to him, my son, right now, if we can get a signal?" Elena's hands shook again, this time from something closer to hope than exhaustion. Yes, I would." General Reyes dialed on the in-flight Wi-Fi call feature, and after a moment, a man's voice answered, gravelly and warm. "Dad, everything okay?" "David," Reyes said, his voice unusually gentle. "I found her." There was a pause. "Found who?" "Your medic." Silence stretched over the line for 3 full seconds. Then a broken voice said, "You're kidding me." Elena took the phone with trembling hands. "Hi, David. This is Elena. I was your medic in Kandahar." What followed wasn't dramatic Hollywood dialogue. It was simple. David thanked her, his voice cracking. He told her about his daughters, 8 and 11, about coaching Little League on Saturday mornings, about the ordinary, beautiful life he'd built because someone refused to let him die on a dirt road in Afghanistan. "I used to have nightmares," David admitted, "about the medic who worked on me. I never saw her face clearly. I was in and out of consciousness, but I remembered her voice. She kept talking to me the whole time, telling me my mom was waiting for me, telling me to stay with her. I've told that story to my daughters 100 times. The lady who wouldn't let me go. Elena pressed her hand against her chest, steadying herself. I talk to all my patients, she said softly, even when they can't answer, especially when they can't answer. I don't know why I do it. It just feels wrong to let someone go through something like that in silence. It worked, David said simply. I'm here because of it. Elena cried openly now, and no one around her looked away in discomfort. Diego dabbed his eyes with a napkin he'd grabbed from the galley. Tyler stared out the window, blinking hard and pretending it was the cabin pressure, and even Richard sat with his head bowed, quiet and still, his earlier bravado nowhere to be found. I never got to say goodbye to my patients, Elena said softly into the phone. I never knew what happened after. Thank you for telling me you're okay. Thank you for making sure I got the chance to be, David replied. When the call ended, General Reyes took Elena's hand in both of his, the way an elder blesses a soldier. You gave me 13 more years with my son, he said. There is no dinner, no upgrade, no seat assignment in this world that could repay that. The plane descended through the last of the storm clouds into clear night sky, city lights spreading beneath them like scattered stars. Elena looked out the window, feeling lighter than she had in years, not because the world had changed, but because for once, someone had seen her. She thought about all the shifts before this one, all the thank yous that never came, all the families who left the hospital too grief-stricken to say goodbye properly, and she let herself simply feel grateful for one night where the universe had circled back around to close a loop she thought would stay open forever. The wheels touched down smoothly, and a ripple of quiet applause moved through the cabin, not the routine kind passengers give out of habit, but something warmer, more deliberate, as if everyone on board understood they'd witnessed something rare. As passengers gathered their bags, Richard turned to her one final time. For what it's worth, he said, you reminded me why the person next to you matters more than the seat they're sitting in. Elena nodded. Try telling that to yourself next time you're tired and cranky at a gate agent. He almost smiled. Deal. General Reyes walked with her down the jet bridge, an unlikely pair, a retired 3-star general and an exhausted ER nurse in wrinkled scrubs, both changed by 90 minutes in the air. Tyler and Richard trailed a few steps behind, uncharacteristically quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts about the flight they'd just shared. Before they parted at baggage claim, General Reyes handed Elena a card. If you ever need anything, he said, anything at all, medical equipment for that hospital, a letter of recommendation, a favor, anything, call this number. And Elena, thank you for choosing to keep showing up, even when the world doesn't see it. Most people don't understand what that kind of quiet sacrifice costs. I do. My son does. We won't forget it. Elena hugged the card to her chest like something fragile. Tell David I'd love to meet him someday, not as a hero, just as a nurse who's glad he's around to coach Little League. I'll tell him, Reyes said, and for a moment, the retired general's composed exterior cracked just slightly, his eyes shining in the fluorescent light of the terminal. Richard approached last, hands in his pockets, looking younger somehow than he had at the start of the flight. I meant what I said about the hospital, he told her. You'll hear from Dr. Whitfield by the end of the week. I believe you, Elena said, and she did. She watched them all disappear into the crowd, one by one, then looked down at her badge, still clipped crookedly to her scrub top. For the first time in a long time, she felt proud of it, not because anyone had told her to be, but because she remembered, all at once, exactly why she'd chosen this work in the first place. That flight taught me something I've carried ever since. The people we judge fastest are often the ones carrying the heaviest loads. A nurse in wrinkled scrubs, a soldier without his uniform, a stranger in the next seat whose story we haven't asked about yet. At 35,000 feet, everyone wears the same seatbelt. It's character, not appearance, that truly separates us. If this story moved you, hit subscribe. There are more flights, more stories, and more lessons waiting at altitude. I'm Captain Marcus Brooks. Safe travels.